The most famous highway in America ran through towns that would not serve a black man a glass of water, and the best food on that highway came out of kitchens those towns pretended did not exist. Victor Hugo Green published a slim guidebook in 1936 so black families would know which doors were safe to walk through. Every cafe listed in those pages served plates built from the cheapest cuts and the sharpest skills in the kitchen. Number 19 fed a whole family for less than a hamburger cost across the road. Number 7 took all day to prepare and carried a richness no fast order could touch. And number 1 was never written on any menu, but every cafe kept it near the register. These stops were not charity. They were proof that black cooks built a food economy along the highway while the rest of the road refused them a seat. Hit subscribe because this is the kind of history that deserves to be remembered. Here are 25 soul foods served at black roadside cafes on Route 66. Number 25, fried catfish plate, a whole catfish fillet dredged in seasoned cornmeal and dropped into a cast iron skillet of hot oil until the coating turned dark gold and the flesh inside flaked apart at the touch of a fork. Catfish was the fish of the black roadside cafe for one reason. It was cheap, it was local, and it fried fast. Along the Missouri and Oklahoma stretches of Route 66, catfish came from farm ponds and river bends within a few miles of the kitchen. A plate arrived with 2 fillets stacked over white bread, a scoop of coleslaw on the side, and a bottle of hot sauce already on the table. The cornmeal crust held a crunch that stayed even after the plate cooled, and the flavor carried a faint sweetness from the fresh water the fish grew up in. Catfish was the plate a regular ordered without looking at the menu. Number 24, smothered pork chops, bone-in pork chops browned hard in a skillet, then buried under a thick onion gravy and covered with the lid until the meat fell loose from the bone and the gravy turned dark enough to stain the plate. Smothered pork chops were a supper plate at black roadside cafes across the Oklahoma stretch, and they came with rice or mashed potatoes to catch the gravy. The browning was everything. A cook who rushed past the sear ended up with pale meat and thin gravy, and a customer who had eaten this dish all his life could tell from the first forkful whether the pan had been hot enough. The onions dissolved into the sauce and disappeared, leaving behind a sweetness that balanced the salt of the pork. A plate of smothered chops told a traveler the kitchen was not cutting corners. Number 23, chicken livers, dusted in seasoned flour and fried in a shallow pool of oil until the outside crisped and the inside stayed pink and soft. Chicken livers cost almost nothing because most people passed them over at the butcher counter, and a pound of livers produced enough to serve half a dozen plates. Black roadside cafes sold them as a plate lunch with rice and gravy or piled on white bread as a sandwich. The mineral taste separated them from everything else on the fryer, and the texture was softer and richer than any piece of fried chicken. Some kitchens dipped them in buttermilk before the flour to tame the iron flavor. Others left it sharp on purpose. Number 22, fried okra, whole pods cut crosswise, tossed in seasoned cornmeal, and dropped into hot oil until every piece turned golden and the natural moisture inside cooked off into a shell that cracked between the teeth. Fried okra showed up as a side dish on nearly every plate lunch at black roadside cafes along the southern stretches, and the quality of it told you everything about the cook. A good batch was dry and popping with a crunch that held even after the plate sat for 10 minutes. A bad batch went limp and greasy before it reached the table. The difference was always temperature. A cook who kept the oil at a raw produced okra worth reaching for twice. One who let the heat drop produced something nobody finished. Number 21, hamburger steak with onion gravy, a thick patty of seasoned beef stretched with stale bread and egg to hold its shape, seared flat in a hot skillet, and then drowned in a dark onion gravy. This was working man's food, the kind of plate a trucker or a field hand ordered when he wanted something heavy enough to last until the next morning. The bread inside kept the patty moist under the weight of the gravy, and it was served on a plate with rice or white bread to soak up what was left. No bun, no lettuce, no tomato. This was not a hamburger. It was a steak dinner built from the cheapest cut in the case, and the gravy made it worth more than the price on the board. Number 20, hoe cakes with cane syrup. Nothing but ground corn, water, and a pinch of salt, spooned onto a greased skillet and fried flat until the edges browned and the center held firm. Hoe cakes were older than every other item on this countdown. The name came straight from the fields, where workers cooked the batter on the flat blade of a hoe held over a fire when no kitchen was in reach. At black roadside cafes, hoe cakes arrived stacked 3 high with cane syrup running down the sides, and they showed up at breakfast alongside eggs and sausage or at supper in place of sliced bread. The syrup pooled in every crack and crevice of the surface, and a stack vanished from a plate faster than biscuits ever did. Number 19, neck bones over rice, vertebrae from the hog's spine, seared in a cast iron pot until the surfaces browned, then simmered for hours with onion, garlic, and bay leaf until the meat loosened enough to slide free with the press of a thumb. The broth went cloudy with rendered fat and collagen, and by the time the pot was done, the liquid had thickened into a natural gravy that needed no flour or butter. Spooned over a hill of white rice, this was one of the cheapest plates a black roadside cafe could serve and one of the slowest to prepare. The bones went into the pot at sunrise. The rice did not start until the afternoon. In between, the kitchen filled with a smell heavy enough to pull a driver off the highway before he had made up his mind to stop. The bones came from the same hog that produced the chops, the ribs, and the ham, but they sold for a fraction of any of those cuts because no mainstream butcher bothered to display them. Black cafe owners bought them by the crate, and the yield was modest. Each vertebra carried only a few ounces of meat, but that meat had a concentrated, marrow-rich flavor that no loin or shoulder could rival. Eating them required both hands, a stack of napkins, and the willingness to pull each piece of flesh from between the ridges of the bone. There was no elegant way to eat this dish, and nobody in these cafes expected one. For a family on the road with more miles ahead than money in the glove box, a shared plate was the meal that made the math work. The bones cost nearly nothing, the rice cost less, and the pot fed every seat at the table. Number 18, deviled eggs. Hard-boiled eggs halved lengthwise, the yolks mashed with mayonnaise, mustard, and a pinch of paprika, then spooned back into the whites. Deviled eggs were not a main course. They sat on the counter in a covered dish, available by the piece, and a traveler could eat 2 or 3 while waiting for a plate to come up from the kitchen. The eggs required no heat to serve and lasted for hours, which made them ideal for a roadside cafe with a small kitchen and a counter that never stopped. The paprika on top was decoration, but the mustard underneath was the flavor that stayed. A deviled egg was a small courtesy from a kitchen that understood waiting. Number 17, fried bologna on bread. A single round of bologna, slashed at the edges to keep it flat, dropped into a hot skillet until the surface blistered and the fat rendered into the pan, then laid on white bread with mustard and a slice of raw onion. This was the cheapest hot sandwich a roadside cafe could offer, and the slashing was the only thing that separated a cook who understood the cut from one who let the meat curl into a dome and char at the rim. The blistered surface carried a salt and smoke flavor that bore no resemblance to cold bologna peeled from a package. One round on bread with mustard came together in under 3 minutes and cost less than anything else behind the counter. Speed and price made it the driving sandwich. Number 16, smoked jowl, the cheek of a hog cured in salt and smoked until the fat turned translucent and the lean meat darkened to the color of old mahogany. Smoked jowl was sliced thin and fried in its own fat, and it tasted like bacon with more depth and a chewier texture that held up under heat. At black roadside cafes, jowl was the seasoning meat that went into pots of greens, pans of beans, and skillets of eggs. A single smoked jowl could season a week of cooking, and when it was sliced and fried on its own, it produced a breakfast plate that cost the kitchen almost nothing. The jowl sat in the icebox wrapped in paper, and a cook reached for it whenever a pot needed flavor or a plate needed protein. Number 15, hot links with white bread and pickles. Coarsely ground pork sausage, heavily spiced with cayenne and paprika, smoked low over wood until the casing snapped when you bit through it. Hot links were eaten on plain white bread with sliced dill, pickles, and yellow mustard, and nothing else. No plate, no fork. You picked it up and ate it standing if you had to. This was road food in its purest form, the kind of meal you could order at a counter, eat in the parking lot, and be back on the highway in 10 minutes. The links were made in-house at the cafes that took them seriously, and the spice level varied by region. Oklahoma ran them mild to medium. Texas pushed them hot enough to make your eyes water. Either way, they sold fast. There is a reason every dish on this countdown traces back to the same handful of ingredients. The cooks who ran these kitchens along Route 66 were not following recipes passed down in leather-bound books. They were running businesses in hostile territory. A black cafe owner in the 1940s or 1950s operated without bank loans, without wholesale accounts from the big distributors, and without the protection of a legal system that treated black property as worth defending. Every ingredient in the kitchen had to be sourced through relationships, not catalogs. A farmer who raised hogs sold the parts the packing house did not want. A neighbor who grew okra or tomatoes brought a bushel to the back door. The menu at these cafes was not a creative choice. It was an inventory of what could be gotten, what could be stored, and what could be cooked fast enough to serve a traveler who might never come back. The food was brilliant because the margins were brutal. Number 14, chili on noodles. Seasoned ground beef, simmered in a thick sauce of tomatoes, onion, garlic, chili powder, cumin, and cayenne, ladled over a plate of boiled spaghetti and topped with chopped raw onion and a shake of hot sauce. This was not a Mexican bowl, and it was not an Italian plate. It was a dish that black cooks along Route 66 assembled from two cheap, shelf-stable ingredients that traveled well and cooked fast, and the result belonged to no tradition except the one built inside these kitchens. This combination showed up at black roadside cafes across the Oklahoma and Texas stretches, where Southern, Mexican, and frontier cooking blurred into something no cookbook had a name for. A pot of chili held all day on a low flame, and a box of dried noodles kept on the shelf for months. Together, they produced a plate that was filling, cheap, and familiar enough that a traveler from Mississippi recognized the chili, and a traveler from Texas recognized the heat, even if neither of them had seen it spooned over pasta before. The dish carried a quiet geography lesson. The chili powder came from the same dried peppers that Mexican cooks used across the border. The noodles came from the same Italian imports that fed factory workers in the northern cities. The technique, low and slow in one pot, was pure Southern. A plate of this at a black roadside cafe on Route 66 was three food traditions meeting at a counter stool, served by a cook who never credited any of them because she was too busy feeding the next car that pulled in. Number 13, cornbread dressing, crumbled cornbread mixed with sauteed onion, celery, sage, and broth from whatever bird had been roasting in the oven, then baked in a cast iron skillet until the top crisped and the inside turned into a dense, savory mass that held together on a fork. Cornbread dressing was the holiday dish that leaked into the everyday menu at black roadside cafes because the ingredients were always on hand and the leftovers improved overnight. The sage was the flavor that carried the dish, and a kitchen that measured it by feel rather than by spoon produced a dressing that tasted different from anything a written recipe could replicate. Served as a side with smothered meat or roast pork, it turned a plate lunch into a Sunday dinner on a Wednesday afternoon. Number 12, peach cobbler. Canned peaches or fresh ones, when the season was right, sweetened with sugar and cinnamon, and baked under a blanket of biscuit dough until the top browned and the fruit bubbled up through the cracks in streams of golden syrup. Peach cobbler was the year-round dessert at black roadside cafes because canned peaches were cheap and available when no other fruit was in reach. The biscuit topping was the same dough used for breakfast, rolled thinner and pressed over the fruit in rough patches rather than smooth sheets. A warm square of peach cobbler served at the end of a plate lunch was the kind of finish that made a traveler stop talking, and the cafes that kept a pan of it behind the counter sold through it before the afternoon ended. Number 11, pig feet, split lengthwise, boiled in seasoned water until the cartilage softened and the skin turned gelatinous, then served in a bowl with the cooking liquid and a splash of vinegar. Pig feet were sold two ways at black roadside cafes, hot out of the pot or pickled in a jar of brine that sat on the counter beside the register. The hot version was a meal. The pickled version was a snack pulled from the jar with tongs and wrapped in wax paper for the road. The texture was slippery and dense, and eating a pig foot required working around the bones and tendons with fingers and teeth. There was no tidy way to do it, and nobody who ordered one expected tidy. Pig feet belonged to the same economy as every other offal cut on this list. The parts the packing house could not sell became the foundation of a kitchen that wasted nothing. The Interstate Highway Act did not mention black roadside cafes by name. It did not have to. When the new 4-lane highways bypassed the small towns where these cafes stood, the travelers who kept them alive simply never drove past the door again. A cafe that depended on Route 66 traffic could not survive when the road was rerouted miles to the south or east. The building stayed, the signs rusted, the screen doors stopped swinging, and the cooks who had built those kitchens from cuts nobody else wanted and produced nobody else would sell them took their knowledge home and kept cooking for their families because the food was never the problem. The country built a new road and forgot to tell anyone where the kitchens went. Number 10, corn pudding. Kernels stripped off the ear, stirred into a batter of eggs, milk, butter, and sugar, and baked in a casserole dish until the top firmed and the center stayed soft and custardy. Corn pudding sat between a side dish and a dessert, sweet enough to eat on its own, but savory enough to hold a place next to a plate of meat and greens. At black roadside cafes during the summer months, corn pudding was the dish that used the ears too mature for frying and too plentiful to waste. The baked surface developed a golden crust that gave way when a spoon broke through it, and underneath, the custard held pockets of whole kernels that burst with the sweetness no canned corn could match. Number 9, meatloaf with tomato glaze, seasoned beef stretched with stale bread, egg, and diced onion, shaped into a loaf and baked with a thick coat of ketchup or tomato paste on top until the glaze caramelized and turned sticky. Meatloaf was working man's food, and it sat on the menu at black roadside cafes as one of the most dependable plates a kitchen could offer. It sliced clean, held its shape on a plate, and reheated well the next day. The tomato glaze was what lifted it. That layer of reduced sweetness over seasoned beef gave the dish a signature beyond just ground meat in a pan. Served alongside mashed potatoes and green beans, a plate of meatloaf looked like it came from a home kitchen. And at these cafes, the resemblance was the whole idea. Number 8, sweet potato pie. Boiled sweet potatoes mashed smooth with butter, sugar, eggs, cinnamon, and nutmeg, poured into a pastry crust and baked until the filling set and the surface darkened to a deep burnt orange. This pie was not pumpkin pie, though people who had never eaten one confused the two. The sweet potato carried a denser, earthier sweetness that sat heavier on the tongue, and the spice was gentler because the potato did most of the work on its own. At black roadside cafes, slices sat on the counter behind the register, cut to order and eaten without whipped cream or any other addition. A single pie cut into 8 slices sold through before the afternoon was over. The crust was secondary. The filling carried the whole weight, and anyone who confused it with pumpkin pie had never sat at one of these counters. Number 7, oxtail stew, sections of beef tail browned in a heavy pot until the fat rendered and the bone surfaces sealed, then braised low and slow in a broth of tomatoes, onion, garlic, thyme, and bay leaf until the collagen melted into the liquid and the meat surrendered from the bone without resistance. Oxtail stew was the dish that took all day and tasted like it. The gelatin released from the connective tissue turned the broth into something closer to a sauce, thick and glossy and rich in a way that no added thickener could reproduce. At black roadside cafes, oxtail was a weekend dish because the braising time made it impractical for a Tuesday. A cook started the pot before dawn, and the stew was not ready until midday, and by then the kitchen had spent hours filled with a smell that worked like an open sign. Oxtail cost less than any other beef cut because the tail was the last thing a butcher sold and the first thing he was willing to let go at a discount. A few pounds of oxtail produced a pot of stew large enough to feed a dozen plates, and every plate came with rice and a piece of bread to sweep the bowl clean. The meat from an oxtail was unlike any other cut on the animal. It was dark, lean between the layers of fat, and so deeply flavored from the constant work the tail did during the animal's life that a single bite carried more intensity than an entire steak. The bones left behind in the bottom of the bowl were sucked clean by anyone who grew up eating this dish because the marrow inside the center of each vertebra was the best part, and leaving it behind was a waste no one in these kitchens could afford. A pot of oxtail stew on a Saturday afternoon was the closest a roadside cafe came to a declaration. It said the kitchen had time, skill, and a supplier who saved the right cuts. Number 6, pickled beets and eggs. Hard-boiled eggs dropped into a jar of pickled beet brine and left overnight until the whites turned a deep magenta and the beet flavor soaked through to the yolk. The eggs sat in a jar on the counter at black roadside cafes, visible through the glass, and a customer could point at the jar and have one peeled and plated in seconds. The vinegar gave the egg a sharp tang, and the beet added an earthy sweetness underneath that separated it from a plain pickled egg. No cooking required, no plate necessary. A pickled beet egg was a counter snack for a driver who wanted something in his stomach without waiting for the kitchen. Number 5, barbecued rib tips. The short, cartilage-heavy ends, trimmed from a rack of spare ribs before the butcher sold the main slab. Rib tips were the scraps, and at black roadside cafes, they were smoked low over hickory or pecan wood until the cartilage turned tender and the meat around it picked up enough smoke to taste like the expensive ribs without the expensive price. Served chopped on white bread with sauce, the style of which shifted depending on which state the cafe sat in. Rib tips were the barbecue plate that a traveler could afford without planning for it. The cartilage gave each bite a chew that straight rib meat did not have, and the edges charred and crisped under the smoke in a way that made the tips more interesting to eat than the center cut rack they were trimmed from. Number 4, mustard greens with potlikker. A mess of mustard greens cooked low in a pot with a smoked ham hock until the leaves turned dark and silky, and the broth at the bottom, the potlikker, held enough vitamins and flavor to be a meal on its own. Mustard greens had a sharper bite than collards or turnip greens, a peppery edge that some kitchens softened with a splash of vinegar and others left alone. At black roadside cafes, greens were the side that came with every plate, whether the customer ordered them or not. The potlikker was sopped up with cornbread, and anyone who drained the liquid and left it in the bowl was wasting the part of the dish the cook considered most important. Number 3, slab bacon and biscuits. Thick-cut bacon, sliced from a whole slab, not peeled from a package, fried in its own fat until the edges curled and the meat turned chewy and deeply smoked. Served on a plate with 2 split biscuits and a cup of black coffee, this was the breakfast that fueled the first leg of the day for every traveler who stopped at a black roadside cafe before sunrise. The bacon from a whole slab tasted different from anything pre-sliced. The cure was deeper, the smoke was heavier, the fat rendered slower, and left a residue in the pan that the cook used to fry the eggs for the next customer. Nothing about this breakfast was ornamental. It was fuel, cut thick, and eaten fast. Number 2, chicken backs and necks. The parts of the bird that the butcher sold in bulk for almost nothing because no mainstream customer wanted to deal with the bones. Chicken backs and necks were seasoned, floured, and fried alongside the breasts and thighs, but they required more work to eat because the meat clung to the spine and vertebrae in small pockets that had to be pulled loose with teeth and fingers. The flavor was deeper than breast meat, and the skin crisped tighter around the bones. At black roadside cafes, a bag of fried backs and necks cost a fraction of a regular fried chicken plate and produced the same satisfaction for anyone willing to do the work. The backs and necks were never on the menu board. You had to know to ask, and the people who asked had grown up eating them at home. Number 1, pecan pralines. There is no version of this countdown that ends anywhere else. Pecan pralines were not a menu item. They were not listed on any chalkboard or printed on any card. They sat in a jar or on a plate near the register, wrapped in wax paper, and a customer dropped a few coins on the counter and took one on the way out the door. Pecans, sugar, butter, and cream cooked in a pot until the mixture reached the point where it would set into a sandy, crumbling dish the moment it hit a sheet of wax paper. The praline was the last thing a traveler tasted before getting back on the highway, and the sweetness stayed on the tongue for miles. Every ingredient came from within reach. The pecans fell from the trees in the yard. The butter came from the icebox. The sugar was the same sugar that sweetened the tea. A pecan praline was a kitchen saying goodbye in the only language it had, and no traveler who took one ever forgot where it came from. Route 66 is a museum piece now. The asphalt cracked, the screen doors stopped swinging, and the hand-painted signs weathered off the fence posts. But the food outlasted the highway. The cooks who built those kitchens took their knowledge home when the interstate bypassed their towns, and they kept cooking for their families because the food was never what failed. Number 22, rice and tomato gravy. A bowl of white rice under a ladle of gravy made from canned tomatoes, rendered fat, flour, salt, and black pepper. That was lunch at dozens of Green Book cafes across South Carolina and Georgia. Some cooks added a slice of onion or a splash of Worcestershire. Most did not. The gravy was thin, almost a soup, and it stained the rice pink. Families called it tomato gravy or red gravy, depending on the county they came from. No restaurant today puts rice and tomato gravy on the menu. It is too simple, too poor, too honest about where it came from. The market decided it was not worth selling.
Chicken fricassee was the kind of dish that took its time and gave back even more. You started with an old hen or a young bird that would not roast right, cut into pieces, dusted in flour, and browned in a hot skillet until golden. Then came the onions, garlic, and broth, maybe a splash of milk or cream if you had it. Everything simmered low and slow until the chicken was so tender it practically melted off the bone. What you ended up with was a silky, comforting gravy and meat that tasted like it had been loved for hours. It was spooned over mashed potatoes, egg noodles, or even a thick slice of bread. No two fricassees were ever quite the same. Some were light, some were dark, some were thick, others were thin. But they all had that one thing in common. They were made with care. It used to be a farmhouse favorite, passed down in splattered notebooks and whispered kitchen instructions. If you ever get the chance to try it, you will understand why it mattered.
Number 23, fried corn. Not cream corn from a can, not corn on the cob. Fried corn in a Green Book cafe meant fresh kernels, cut straight off the ear and cooked in rendered fat with a little sugar and salt until the edges browned and the natural starch thickened into something close to pudding. It came as a side on nearly every plate from June through September. The cook needed nothing but a sharp knife, a hot skillet, and corn that was picked that morning. When the cafes closed, fried corn held on in home kitchens for another generation. But by the 1990s, frozen and canned corn had replaced the fresh ear entirely. The dish requires corn picked the same day to work. Stale kernels do not release enough starch. That is why it never traveled.
Ash cake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ash cake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes.
Number 24, pig's ear sandwich. The travelers who pulled into a Green Book cafe near the Delta and saw this on the chalkboard knew they were in a real kitchen. Pig's ears scrubbed clean, boiled for hours, pressed flat between two plates overnight, then sliced and fried until the edges crisped. Served on white bread with yellow mustard and a pickle spear. The texture sat somewhere between pork rind and cartilage. Ears were scrap parts that butchers kept for anyone who asked. The sandwich was pure profit for the cafe because the ingredient itself was treated as waste. After the cafes closed, pig's ears went back to home kitchens, then faded out entirely as the next generation left the South and left offal behind. Before this list goes any further, For anyone who wants dishes like these in one place, the recipes that keep showing up on this channel have been gathered in a book called Big Mama's Soul Food Kitchen at thehungryhistorian.com. This is the only mention. If that sounds right, it is there. Now, back to the list.
Depression meatloaf was the kind of meal that told you how to survive without ever saying a word. You took a little bit of ground meat, beef, pork, or whatever you could find, and stretched it with oats, breadcrumbs, eggs, and onions. Some people added shredded carrots. Others used mashed beans. It was not about taste so much as getting food on the table. You mixed it all together, packed it into a loaf pan, and baked it until the top crusted over and the smell told you it was done. It was often topped with ketchup or brown sugar, but never anything fancy. You served it with boiled potatoes or canned vegetables, and you did not complain. This meatloaf was a lifeline during hard times. It showed up on tables across the country, not because people loved it, but because it worked. And over time, people did grow to love it, not just for the flavor, but for what it meant. A full stomach, a quiet evening, a family sitting down together.
Here is something worth understanding about these cafes. The Green Book was published from 1936 to 1966, 30 years of a travel guide that existed because Black Americans needed to know where they would not be turned away, arrested, or worse. The cafes listed in it were not restaurants in any modern sense. They were kitchens that happened to have a counter. Many operated out of the front room of a private home. The menu changed depending on what the cook had that morning. The prices covered the cost of groceries, not profit margins. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 opened every lunch counter in the country, Black travelers no longer needed the Green Book. The guide stopped publishing, and hundreds of Black-owned cafes that had survived on the simple fact of being necessary quietly closed because necessity was no longer enough. Number 20, Country Captain Chicken. This dish entered the South through the port of Savannah, where spice traders brought curry powder from India in the early 1800s.
Potato and egg skillet hash was the end-of-the-week answer to a cluttered fridge and a hungry crew. Leftover boiled potatoes were chopped and tossed into a skillet, crisped up in bacon grease until their edges turned golden and their middles stayed soft. Onions came next, always onions, bringing sweetness and bite. Then came the eggs, scrambled in or laid on top, steaming and golden. Some families added cheese, some tossed in scraps of ham or sausage. But at its heart, this was a dish built on economy and instinct. You used what you had, you worked fast, you fed everyone, and it always tasted better than it had any right to. This was breakfast for supper. It was late nights and early mornings. It was the smell of something frying while boots dried by the door. Now, hash is something you see on brunch menus, dressed up with hollandaise or avocado, but the real version, the farmhouse version, was much simpler, much better. It was about making something from almost nothing and doing it with care.
Number 21, sweet potato pone, not a pie, not a casserole, a pone, raw sweet potatoes grated by hand on a box grater, mixed with cane syrup, cinnamon, ginger, and a little butter, then baked in a heavy pan until the top cracked and the center set to something between custard and cornbread. Green Book cafes in Alabama and Mississippi served a pone as dessert, but most travelers ate it as a side because it went with everything. The word pone comes from the Algonquin apan, meaning baked. By the 1960s, sweet potato pie had replaced pone on nearly every cafe menu because pie was easier to slice and serve. Pone had to be scooped. It looked rough, but it tasted like the potato itself, not like sugar and eggs. That was the whole point, and that is exactly what disappeared. Number 17, Souse meat plate. Souse separated a real Green Book cafe from a place pretending to be one. Made from a whole hog's head, cleaned and boiled until the meat slid off the skull, then chopped fine with onion, vinegar, and hot pepper, packed into a loaf pan, and chilled overnight. The gelatin from the bones held it firm. The cook sliced it cold and laid 2 slices on a plate with salt and crackers, mustard, and a pickle. No stove work at service time, no last-minute assembly. Souse sat ready in the icebox for a week. For a cafe run by one woman with no help, that mattered more than flavor. The taste was sharp, vinegary, and deeply porky. Travelers either ordered it by name or pushed the plate back at first sight. Souse meat left public dining entirely by the 1980s. Modern meat processors no longer sell whole hog heads to retail customers. The ingredient vanished before the recipe did. Number 16, red rice with smoked sausage. Low country food brought inland by black cooks who had moved from the Sea Islands to cities like Columbia and Atlanta. Rice cooked in tomato paste, onion, and the rendered fat of smoked sausage until every grain turned red and carried the smoke. Green Book cafes in South Carolina and coastal Georgia served it as a main dish, not a side, a full plate with 2 thick slices of sausage alongside. The dish traces its roots to West African jollof rice, though nobody in a 1950s cafe used that name. They called it red rice or Savannah rice or tomato rice. After desegregation, the cafes that served it closed, and red rice retreated to family reunions and church suppers. By the 2000s, even those gatherings had largely moved on.
Dried pinto beans were one of the first things families stocked up on because they lasted forever, filled bellies fast, and cost next to nothing during a time when every penny mattered. These beans sat quietly in cloth sacks or glass jars on pantry shelves, waiting to turn into something warm and sustaining after long days of trying to get by. Pinto beans did not need much, just water, a little heat, and maybe a scrap of fat back if the kitchen was lucky that week. They simmered slow, softening into a thick pot of comfort that could stretch across several meals, sometimes feeding large families for days. Kids grew up recognizing the familiar smell drifting from the stove, a sign that dinner was going to be simple but steady, the kind of food that kept people moving through hard winters and harder workdays. Pinto beans were survival food, but they were also memory food, tying families together with the quiet understanding that something small and humble could carry you through. They were a backbone ingredient in countless homes because they worked every time, no matter how thin the pantry looked. Dried pinto beans did not just feed families, they steadied them. Venison pot pie was a celebration of the hunt and a lesson in slow cooking. When deer season ended and meat filled the freezer, farm families would stew chunks of venison with carrots, onions, potatoes, and peas in a thick brown gravy. That filling went into a deep pie dish and was topped with a flaky, buttery crust made from scratch. The pie baked until golden, the filling bubbling at the edges, and the scent filling every corner of the kitchen. It was a full meal in one dish, rich and comforting. The venison was gamey but tender, the vegetables sweet from slow simmering, and the crust a little crisp on top, soft underneath. It was not fast food. It was not clean food. It was the kind of supper that left the table quiet, except for the clink of forks and the second helpings. Venison pot pie is rare now. Most people do not hunt. Fewer still bake pies for dinner. But it used to be a farmhouse staple, a reward for a day in the woods, a meal shared with pride. And like most lost suppers, it told a story before you ever took a bite. Syrup bread emerged as the answer when there was nothing to eat but flour and whatever sweetener could be found. Sorghum syrup or molasses, cheaper than sugar and available throughout the South, were drizzled over plain biscuits or cornbread to create something approaching dessert. Black children learned to make this treat themselves, mixing flour and water into simple doughs, baking them quickly, then drowning the results in dark, sticky sweetness. The combination provided quick energy, carbohydrates from bread and concentrated sugars from syrup, delivering calories needed for labor. In sharecropping families, syrup bread appeared frequently because sorghum was often the only sweetener accessible when white landowners controlled access to refined sugar. The practice taught children to find joy in small pleasures, turning basic ingredients into treats through imagination and willingness to make something from nothing. Women sometimes added a little butter or lard to the bread if available, creating richness that complemented syrup's sweetness through ingenious adaptation.
Number 15, pickled pig feet plate. A quart jar of pig feet sat on the counter of almost every Green Book cafe south of the Mason-Dixon line. The feet were split, boiled until tender, then packed into brine with vinegar, bay leaves, peppercorns, and red pepper flakes. Some cooks added cloves. The jar stayed at room temperature behind the register. A customer pointed, the cook fished one out with tongs, set it on a plate with saltine crackers and hot sauce, and that was the meal. No cooking required once the jar was filled. The pickled pig foot was the original ready-to-eat protein a century before the convenience store wrap sandwich. Pig feet are still sold in jars at some grocery stores today, but the practice of eating one off a cafe counter, standing up, cracker in one hand, has been extinct for decades. If your people drove Route 66 when the Green Book was the only map that mattered, you already know what these plates tasted like. Fry the catfish when the fillets come in fresh. Simmer the oxtail if your kitchen still carries that patience. Set the pralines by the door where they belong. Drop the one dish your family would have ordered at the counter.